All right, let's get started. I'd like to welcome you to today's ELGL webinar titled Connecting Local Government and Education. I'm ELGL Executive Director Kirsten Wyatt, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's presentation. ELGL is the Engaging Local Government Leaders Network, and we engage the brightest minds in local government. And one of the ways we do this is to provide exceptional and free online training about local government topics. We are pleased to again be partnering with the Davenport Institute at Pepperdine University. And the Davenport Institute's mission is to help build stronger communities by promoting public participation in local government. You can join us every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific for the next 3 weeks for our webinar series about engagement and building strong communities. And so today we're talking about the whirlwind of change for schools as many districts figure out the best way to reopen safely. And this transition to remote online learning that happened almost overnight back in March. So we'll talk about what this conversation looks like at the school district level, and then also about how school boards can work with their local governments to best balance reopening restrictions while reassuring parents. And today we have an all-star panel comprised of school officials and a local government expert. Chelsea King is with the West Linn Wilsonville School Board as the vice chair, and that's in the Portland metro area. Charles Hartgrove is the assistant director at the Virginia Institute of Government, and Angela Cutbill is with the Las Virgenes School Board, serving as the vice president, and that's in the West Valley area of the Los Angeles metro area. This webinar is free for ELGL members, and if you've logged on and you're not yet a member, we would love to have you. You can sign up at elgl.org/membership, and memberships are $40 a year per person, and they enable us to provide awesome content like today's session. We will save a recording of this webinar in the ELGL webinar library on elgl.org, and we're streaming this live in the ELGL members only Facebook group. So before we begin, please make sure that your microphones are muted, and this makes the webinar enjoyable for everyone. You can ask questions in the chat box during the presentation, and at the end we'll open up and you can ask your question live if you choose. And when you ask those questions, I'll moderate, make sure that all of your questions get answered or get addressed. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Pooja Giovanna from the Davenport Institute to get us started today.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Pooja Giovanna. I'm the Assistant Director at the Davenport Institute at Pepperdine, as you can see from my beautiful virtual background, courtesy of Zoom. I'm very thankful to have everybody here for this conversation, because one area that continued to change and develop rapidly during this time, during COVID, was the school system. The world continued to adapt to the realities presented by this pandemic, and education just went through a whirlwind, a full 180, as teachers changed their lesson plans, administrators rethought testing options, and school board leaders jumped super quickly into ensuring schools had everything they needed to continue. I myself am a former educator, so I understand the difficulty that comes with simply just changing lesson plans is difficult enough. But as the last academic year came to a close, summer brought along with it a promise of a well-deserved rest for teachers and administrators, as well as a hope for school reopenings in the fall. While some schools have sought to reopen in person, many are continuing to stay online. And that brings us to this conversation. What does the conversation look like at the district level? What are some of the most pressing topics that local districts have had to address? And so with that, I open it out to our three lovely speakers who have graciously joined us today. So I ask again, what are some of the most pressing topics that your local districts have addressed? And I open it out to Chelsea, Angela, and Charles.
Good morning. Thank you so much for this opportunity to gather with all of you and to talk about this topic. I'll get us started with this conversation. I had to chuckle a little bit at the idea that administrators had a rest over the summer. I don't think much of that happened. Our teachers do continue to plan for the fall, and our administrators especially, as there was continuous changes coming from the state about whether or not we could open, what that reopening would look like. making decisions about how to move curriculum online, whether or not the district would be moving our entire curriculum online, or if we would be contracting with another company, a private industry that can already has online curriculum in place. Those types of decisions, negotiations with unions, our classified staff unions, our licensed staff unions about what working conditions would look like, how nutrition services would be delivered, what's happening with the busing contract. There was no break over the summer. It's been continuous since March. And in my answer about whether or not administrators got breaks, you also heard some of the topics that we were dealing with. It was basically reimagining our schools from the ground up, everything from transportation and nutrition to the more complex socio-emotional needs of our students, curriculum, assessment. How do we assess what our students are coming in with at the beginning of this year, which will be potentially different than the typical summer break academic lag that we see. And then, of course, safety. And that's a big topic on everybody's minds, the people who we employ, as well as the parents. And so that's been probably at the center of the discussion, is how are we going to keep everybody safe? And then the tail end of that discussion is whether or not we're protected from litigation is now coming in as another, important topic. So it's very complex work. It's tireless. It's continuously changing. We changed our calendar. We're starting school later. Everything has changed. So that's a little bit about what we've been working on in Westland, Wilsonville.
I would concur that our administrators have no break. I've never seen them work this hard. The irony is we talked about not having a board meeting at all in July and kind of taking a break and going dark. And that was 6 months ago. And we laugh about that now because people have been working around the clock. All I know is everything keeps changing. When school got out for us in mid-June, we were planning on reopening. So we invested heavily in PPE and protocols and working with our unions and what that would look like. And then the governor took that option away. And now there's a lot of confusion because our numbers in LA County are starting to look right, where we could apply for a waiver. But we had a local LA County supervisor who said we shouldn't apply for a waiver, that no school should be open. And the whiplash and the mixed messages that we're getting are, confusing for us as well as for our parents. So, even people who have made a decision about school, we had about 20% of our school decide to be completely virtual for the whole year. So we created this virtual academy. Some of those who chose that still want their kids back on campus for music or art or sports, and or saying don't open your schools at all. So everyone has sort of conflicting views, even within themselves. I do. I want schools open for kids. It's what's best for them. They're healthy. I also worry about safety. I worry about our staff. So, I know that it's a continual change, but it's a conflict even within myself about what's the best way to proceed. So I certainly don't blame parents for kind of all the mixed messages they're giving and they're getting.
So you both have spoken about parents, and I wanted to direct the conversation towards how have you found creative ways to engage parents and students about these decisions? I mean, this is not easy for a parent or a student to navigate. So what have been some creative ways that you found to engage, and what are some of the needs that parents and students have communicated?
We've done continual webinars over the summer, our superintendent and our administrative staff, and those have actually been very well attended. We've pushed out a lot of information via email and through other means. The webinars have been, it was the kind of thing, a year ago we would have done a webinar on something and not many people would have watched, and now everybody's watching. But yet we still get some, families who say, I didn't see the information, or, I missed my emails. And, You know, my only answer to that is now more than ever, you got to be watching your emails from your district and your school because everything's changing.
Chelsea, anything to add?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I can't see, there we go. I was trying to see everybody so I don't jump in and talk over the top of someone. This is a very complicated question because, you know, communicating with our parents and our students has always been a challenge. In fact, it's been such a complicated issue that we have 4 district-wide goals in West Linn, Wilsonville. One of them is entirely focused on two-way communication with our public. Historically, in my district, much of our communication has had a one-way flavor, where the district and the board is making a decision and we're pushing it out to the public. And a lot of what we've been doing the past few years is really trying to change our processes so that we're receiving information from the public and applying meaningful contribution to our decisions. It's always been something we wanted to do, but the work is so complicated. And so if you think about everything I just said about the complicated nature of the changes that COVID-19 has put onto our system, and then you add this already complicated process of receiving meaningful feedback from our public, and things like trying to understand the regulations and the metrics that are coming from the state, I mean, it becomes a fascinating topic. I'm sure some people in this room are going to write books about this that I'm going to read down the road because there's so much material here. So yes, like Angela, we've done a lot of email listservs. We've done the video conferencing. Our meetings are on Zoom. We're receiving public comment. We've done surveys. That was actually a very interesting one where we surveyed our students at the end of the previous academic year to find out. I think we surveyed parents as well. We surveyed our community, including students, to find out what worked for them, what kept them engaged. And then, of course, there's a lot of communication with our union because we want to know what teachers think. So there's a lot of communication happening. We had, Angela, you might be able to relate to this as a fellow school board member. We had a meeting where one of the topics was going to be whether or not we were opening in-person school in the fall. Well, we ended up tabling that decision because word kind of came out that the state would be releasing some metrics that would quantify whether or not we could open. In that meeting, there were 100 participants for a school board meeting. That's a little bit unprecedented. But I would like to say one other thing before I yield the floor, and that's that COVID-19 and our coronavirus response, it is at the heart of this discussion, and it's at the heart of much of the work we're doing. But other things have been happening in our communities and nationally as we go through this work. So I'd like to point to 2 things. One is that in my district, we recently passed the largest capital bond that we've ever passed in the history of our district. So we're actively engaged in spending $206 million on infrastructure. So that work continues. Meanwhile, we have a very large social justice movement occurring in our nation and in my city of Portland, Oregon, and in all the surrounding communities. And so the one area that we actually received a huge amount of feedback from our community, we had 26 public comments on one topic, which is a lot of comments to be focused on one topic. I don't know how many students you have, Angela. We have 10,000 students, so we're not a huge district. And that was about a podcast that had come out where one of our long-range planning committee members had made some really inflammatory and racist statements. And so there was an outcry about her appointment on the committee. So I share that story to say that, COVID-19 and the coronavirus response that we've engaged in our public schools and culturally have, it's touched every facet of our work. It's changed everything that we do. And receiving feedback from our community is vital and extraordinarily complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Chelsea. I want to turn it over to Charles, who has anticipated what I was about to do and unmuted himself. Charles, would you mind jumping in and providing a perspective outside of the school board system?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and my background is city and town management for those watching. So I'm not a public school expert, but because of my work in Virginia, a couple things I'll point out for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the things that both local governments and school systems have had to navigate. So, first of all, Virginia is a Dillon rule state. Secondly, in Virginia, school boards do not have taxing authority. So while they can decide how their money is spent within their budget, all the money flows from the state to the city council and the county board of supervisors, and then goes to the school board for them to decide how to spend, but the elected body for the entire locality makes the decision on funding. Another financial piece of this puzzle that everyone has tried to been figuring out the last few months is, the impact and the appropriate use of CARES funding in school systems. A lot of school systems in Virginia, they'll have shared finance departments with the county and the city that they live in for economies of scope and scale. So there's some partnerships there on the financial side of things. So a lot of times you've got county administrators and school superintendents and city managers all working very closely together. I think they were before anyway, but this I think has really impacted that. Another challenge where I think local government and the school systems have intersected is the digital divide. Obviously, every state has a diversity of socioeconomic issues, rural versus urban and suburban, and access to internet is clearly an issue in Virginia as it is in other places. Usually the entity that is really focusing on that is economic development and other general local government folks trying to expand broadband access throughout the locality, particularly in our rural portions of the state in far southwest Virginia and southern Virginia, and I'm sure that's the case in other places. So as school boards, we're making the decision whether or not to be virtual the first either few weeks or the entire first semester, or actually having children and teachers and staff go back to school in person. That was a huge burden for folks to weigh and try to overcome. Number one, not just the access to the internet, but also I think these folks mentioned the devices that students and staff need, the software platforms. Some localities are better suited to make that transition and be available for that because they have the depth of IT support on staff. Sometimes that's another thing that's shared in Virginia localities is IT support staff or consultants are shared by the school system and the main local government. So a lot of really challenging metrics for folks to deal with. And obviously, again, I think Chelsea and Angela mentioned, there's metrics coming down from the governor's office on a regular basis of how you should proceed forward. So school systems and superintendents are getting guidance from the State Department of Education on how to operate, but it's again very challenging. Folks I think have done the best they can considering, but I very much appreciate the work and the hard decisions that folks have had to make on school boards and school superintendents.
One thing that does come up with COVID restrictions being put into place, a major restriction has been social distancing. I know that there's been a couple of controversial pictures on Twitter about hallways as they've reopened and as navigating just simply sitting in class. I would like to ask both Angela and Chelsea to speak on how you've addressed these social distancing needs in your school buildings, physically, literally, and then to Charles on your end from the city management side, conveying those social distancing needs and working with schools to make sure that they do happen.
I'll jump in here. We're pretty good in that this area of Los Angeles, we have a mask order. People are pretty compliant. You can't go into a store. There's distancing everywhere. So we haven't really had to address that. I have a brother who teaches now in Missouri in a rural district, and he's said, we go in a store, we're the only people with masks on. People think we're like, a crazy old couple. So we're lucky in that I think they get it. We were concerned about opening schools and our youngest kids because, kindergartners, they're like roly-polies. They're all over each other. Ironically, I think small children do better with distancing and masks than a lot of adults. So we had instituted, and we still have ready to go, protocols for, dividers and how we, spread kids out in a classroom. And you have to cohort them and, separate them, because you can't get your normal amount of kids in a classroom. Unless you're a very low number class size district, which is not usually the case in public schools. So that part's been easy. The actual social thing has been harder. But we did run some virtual summer camps over the summer that were free, that were all kinds of things from Fortnite to Lego to sort of art. And those were hugely popular. They had waiting lists. So for me, the struggle is not getting the kids to social distance. It's getting them to, how do we socialize in a normal way? And that's the concern about not opening schools for me, is the mental health aspect that we hear a lot about. It's starting to get very wearing. So.
A couple of things I'd like to just, first of all, say that, and I will get to this question about social distancing. And yes, Angela, I feel that in my heart about our kiddos' mental health. If we adults need to not be isolated, our adolescents, particularly at that really vulnerable age of middle school, like 12, 11, 12 to like 14, 15, super vulnerable age. But Charles, one of the things I'm struck by what you were talking about is the way that money moves through your state. And one of the things we think a lot about in my school district is partnership between ourselves and our city government. We have two cities, West Linn and Wilsonville, and we have different relationships with each of those cities. And that influences our work in each of those cities, our partnerships, whether or not we can share property to build parks next to our schools, and whether or not we can use public transportation to move our students. Those things are very important. And just listening to you, Charles, talk about the way money moves, I was thinking a lot about how important that relationship must be between those local governments, and particularly as we think about state and everything that's coming from the state to us. It even highlights how important our local government's relationship is to those state decision makers. Because if they're going to be making budgetary decisions or public health metrics decisions, then that relationship that they have with their local government, and let's not kid ourselves, these are human relationships, right? This is one person to one person often. What are those relationships like, and are we listening to each other? So I just wanted to say, being the audience here and this interest in local government, that seems to be a very relevant point. And then just about the social distancing, it's interesting. We came up with the most amazing operational blueprint. There was we measured classrooms, we divided kids into cohorts, we had the flow, the traffic flow, where they would eat, the busing situation. We applied social distancing and PPE requirements all over the place. Now, we don't necessarily need them right now, because after doing that work, we're not opening. But one of the things that's interesting to me and my school board is that we just passed an emergency policy that freed up our operation department to make purchases larger than $100,000, which typically by policy, that kind of purchase would need to be approved by the school board. We just allowed them to basically buy whatever they want for whatever amount they want, because of things like accessing plexiglass. And I heard this word in a school board meeting. We are in competition with other school districts to purchase plexiglass. And there was something really striking to me when I think about equity. In West Linn, Wilsonville, we have access to resources because our voters, Kirsten Wyatt and colleagues, are amazing. They say yes to everything. So we can buy plexiglass. But what's happening to our public school systems if we need plexiglass to open our schools and we're in competition for these kind of materials and another district doesn't have that kind of money or that kind of school board that's going to allow that type of agile response to the market? And so this need, I'm looping that back around to this need we have for collaboration and cooperation across different branches of government and some sort of coordinated effort, or these divides in our society are just going to continue to get wider and wider.
So I wanted to jump in and say that, to follow up on what you were saying, Chelsea, that it is, you know, you've put in all of these measures, you had this great blueprint, and then we did not reopen, and those measures were not free. They cost a significant amount in terms of budget and in terms of planning and staff time and resources. And like with the plexiglass, this working, getting the physical plexiglass material is not proving to be the easiest, especially if there are districts that are concerned with their budgets for the coming year. So I wanted to invite on that topic Charles to come in to speak on how local governments are working with their school boards and districts to assist in ensuring that they have what they need, and perhaps where are places that they can improve on in that collaboration.
Sure,
Sorry,
thank
Charles,
you.
putting you on the spot there.
That's great. And Chelsea, you made a really good point when you mentioned me earlier, and I'll throw a couple of wrinkles into that conversation that we deal with here in Virginia. So we have a mixture of school boards that are elected and appointed. So it's not consistent throughout the state. So some counties, the Board of Supervisors and the City Council appoints the school board through an application process, and then we have localities that do elections. Again, you can imagine some of the political discussions that happen when you have an elected school board and an elected City Council or Board of Supervisors, but the school board does not, again, have the taxing authority and the ultimate decision on the total amount of dollars they have to spend. So there's definitely conflict from time to time in a few Virginia localities. To your point about equity, I think that is extraordinarily challenging. A lot of our independent cities and rural counties have a they're highly fiscally stressed. So they have a high level of people living at or below the poverty line. They have a lower household median income. And so those school districts are obviously impacted by that, because in Virginia, like most states, the majority of your funding is going to be determined by what your real estate tax assessments are and real estate tax rates. That's where a lot of the funding comes from for cities and county schools beyond the state. That's the local match, as we call it in Virginia. And so obviously, if you're in a very wealthy urban or suburban county in Northern Virginia outside of Washington, D.C., that's not going to be as big an issue for you as it is maybe a smaller county in the tobacco regions of Southside and Southwest Virginia. Talk about equity, another issue that we deal with in Virginia, and some other states have dealt with this too. I know Texas in particular and a few other southern states. We've had some issues dealing with statues. We've had some issues dealing with having to rename schools. So school boards are not only dealing with the challenges of the pandemic, they're dealing with decades and generations and hundreds of years of systemic racism that they're broaching right now in some very challenging public conversation. So on top of school systems having to make the decision, are they opening virtually or a first portion of a year, they're literally having to set up public hearings and commissions on renaming public schools and trying to challenge some of those things. And it goes back to the equity issues of making schools be a place that everyone feels welcome. And you've got to start with some of those hard decisions before you can even have that secondary conversation.
I would echo the concerns about equity, which run across the board. As Chelsea said, it's one of the things we're being contacted about. This summer, we did an online course that we opened up to staff that was about racial equity in education. And I took the class. We had 150 staff members sign up because people want to have this conversation and want to know, how do we move this forward? So the two things we hear about are COVID, but honestly, we've had more emails from a lot of college students who say, you know, I went to your district and maybe this happened to me or maybe nothing happened, but I want to know, what are you doing about this? What is your curriculum changes? What are the conversations in classroom? But we're in an interesting position in that we are in a socioeconomically higher area, yet we still have students of need, and the state of California then has a kind of a reverse funding of that. So we don't get much money from the state. We're in the bottom 15% per pupil funding. And I'm so jealous of your bond, Chelsea. We tried to pass one in March that we desperately needed, and we lost by 100 votes. And I think with the economy, we're not going to be passing another one for a few years. So the thing that, you know, when I get asked what keeps me up at night, it's a lot of equity of kids who don't have access to things. Our neighboring districts, Los Angeles Unified, the second biggest in the country. And, you know, kids are amazingly resilient, but how they rise out of this. Just the other day, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about depression in adolescent girls is just spiking because adolescent girls are more social and it's all about their friends and connecting. So they're left at home, and what are they left with? Social media and texting. And what are the two worst things that make you feel bad about yourself? Social media and texting sometimes, especially for teenagers. So equity is for me the thread that runs through all of these conversations. And money, you're both absolutely right. It's always comes down to the money. There's never enough.
I think if I may just jump into this conversation, Pooja, I don't want to derail the line of questioning, but I think that it would be easy to fall prey to this idea that what's happening with social justice and equity movement, and frankly just dismantling systemic racism, it would be easy for us to think that that is different than COVID-19 and the coronavirus response. But I actually think if we take our perspective up a few levels, then we'll see that they rely hugely on each other. I mean, we could point to things like health outcomes, disparate health outcomes in different communities. That's been well discussed. But what I'm interested in this discussion is how can we look at ways that we can disrupt or dismantle systemic racism as we reconceptualize our public school system. Because COVID-19 has required us to reconceptualize how we are going to deliver education, at least for 1 year. But these moves will have a lasting impact. And so if we're thinking about renaming schools at the same time as we're thinking about whether or not we open them, I mean, I don't have an answer to this question, but I am asking myself this question. How are these decisions related? And every decision we make, like who gets plexiglass or not, and who gets the money to buy PPE or not, and who opens and doesn't open, according to governor's public health metrics, we need to be asking ourselves, are we perpetuating power systems based on race when we make this decision, or are we equalizing our socioeconomic and racial context as we make these decisions?
Absolutely. I think what you both have said, and echoing Charles, this need to mindfully balance, perhaps that's a way to say it, of mindfully balance what's going on around us in this world, not just COVID, because that is necessarily an overarching press on our systems, but everything else that's also happening that is either connected or at the same time, and influencing how administrators and teachers are moving forward. Like Angela, the emails that you were getting from your district and from your former students. So one thing that I'm seeing as an overarching impetus, as a need, is to balance, is to ensure that you are delivering quality education while keeping in mind the equity issues, while keeping in mind the background of students and perhaps other ways that they have been impacted. And then there becomes, so there's balancing issues within the district, with administrators, teachers, students, parents at every level, and then also balancing the relationship with your local government, the different branches, Chelsea, that you spoke on, whether it be on plexiglass or whether it be on the bond or funding. So one thing I do want to go towards is the notion of engaging. You know, both Davenport and ELGL are so focused on engaging with local government leaders, engaging with our communities, that I would like to end on a maybe more positive note. Is what is a positive example of engagement that you have seen within your districts or with your local government branch that you're working with, whether it be with parents, students, what have you, one or two positive examples of engagement. And while you think of those, I'm going to say to everybody else, feel free to drop in questions in the chat. Once we move towards the last couple of minutes of the webinar, we will take questions from the audience. So whoever wants to jump in.
I'll jump in quickly just with something Chelsea already said. Because our meetings have to be on Zoom, we have so many people watching. I mean, nobody's ever been, you know, the idea of having to come down to the district office to a board meeting, unless you're really feeling passionate and want to speak in your public time about something or something on the agenda, we just don't get a lot of people. And we've had, you know, literally a couple of hundred people, which for us, we're about the same size district as you, Chelsea, watching board meetings because they want to know what's happening, what's changing. And I see that as very positive. And so I hope that as we move forward, I see this also with like our local cities. We cover 4 cities. People are watching city council meetings. People are engaging. They're submitting statements beforehand. So for me, that it's so easy to now engage with whatever your decision-making bodies are. I hope that continues, that once we can meet again in person, we still start to stream things online so that people can watch and they can be a part of it. That for me has been a really great thing, kind of an awakening of people to contact us. I love that we have college students who now are contacting us, wanting to know more about, you know, I never paid attention to how you do things. Tell me how you do things. So for me, that's the most one.
Charles, you want to go next?
Sure. You know, I think in these types of times when you have all of these challenges, I think, you know, most public servants, whether they're elected officials or administrators, staff, et cetera, I think what we've seen in Virginia, at least, and what I've seen around the country from the most part, is people are really trying their best to work together, no matter if they're on the local government side or the school system side. You know, the quality of education and the quality of development of the children in your community is usually one of those things that communities can come around and embrace and put other issues aside. And I think most localities have definitely done that to the best of their ability. You know, I again have great respect for folks like Angela and Chelsea and other elected and appointed school board members who have had to navigate these challenges that, you know, you could never have expected when you decided to enter into this work to run for office. And then just you've got a new respect for folks at all levels. You know, sometimes people sort of forget about bus drivers, food service workers, facilities maintenance staff, the people that actually keep school systems and local governments running. I think there's a newfound respect for the challenges that they deal with, and hopefully that'll resonate beyond the pandemic as we try to try to find ways to make sure our children receive quality education in public schools. And that's the bottom line, because we're trying to prepare from a local government standpoint. You're not only providing education, but you're providing workforce for the next generation. You know, so economic developments and the business community are watching closely at what school systems do, because that's very important. That's one of the reasons maybe why that business is located in that locality, because they have an excellent school system and they want a great workforce to pull from for their business. So there's been a lot of victories out there, but there's still a lot of challenges ahead. Yeah,
and we're teaching for the intrinsic value of education and to prepare our future workforce. And also one of the things I've reflected on is how right now we're teaching a generation how to respond to an unprecedented global issue. You know, we had this type of generational impact when the Great Depression hit the United States, and we know of the lasting impact that that had on the way people think. So I'm very curious about how what are we teaching our young people right now about how you respond? And I think that's embedded in your question, Pooja, around some creative ways that we are responding and meeting needs. And, you know, I have seen that in my community. You know, I've seen people sharing and coming together and looking out for each other. And so there's just that human to human or family level, community level response. People, you know, volunteering and delivering meals and donating to food banks and offering to open their homes for internet access. So there's that type of response. But I will share just one story about what happened in our school district in June when there was a threat that high school graduation wouldn't happen. And our class of 2020 was, you know, potentially going to be the first class that didn't have this, you know, pomp and circumstance around their graduation. And so our district came up with a really creative way to have graduation, which looked like putting a stage on the track with socially distanced superintendent and school board member and school principal and a drive-through. So the students came driving through, they stopped, we had a red carpet, student walked the red carpet, family or whoever, friends, parked their car, got out at a viewing platform. We all took photos and then they like finished walking. And it took about 8 hours per school. The speeches were televised and, you know, like live streamed throughout the 8 hours. And actually what I found is that I preferred that ceremony because of the slower pace and the photos and being able to look the student in the eye. And I didn't shake 1,000 sweaty palms like in years past, but that's okay with me. It worked out all right. And we had a great time. So it's just one example of a really creative response to say, hey, we still do these things. They just look different.
Thank you so much. We're very grateful. I will speak on behalf of ELGL to have you here for this conversation. And now I'm going to hand it over to our lovely Kristen Wyatt from ELGL to moderate some of the questions that participants have put into the chat, and then we'll come back.
So first question here, how is the power of wealthy white parents, frequently those who can afford to work from home or not work at all, influencing or being mitigated in your schools during COVID-19?
I'll jump in here first because this is one that's been preoccupying me lately and the community. So we have a bit of a loophole here in that we have on a lot of our campuses, not all of them, childcare providers who do a before school or an extended day. So it depends. We have, excuse me, both the Boys and Girls Club and the Y. And they have separate space, usually portables or perhaps their own facility. Because they're childcare, they're allowed to open. And what they've been doing, and I get this, is they're marketing themselves. They're giving very edu-speak sort of names. This is the Key Academy now. And what they're saying you can do, because we're still not open, is you can drop your kids off. We will have people work with them on their distance learning, and you can drop them for the entire day. And it's very expensive. It's what I think is expensive. You know, if you want to do an all day, it's $850 a month. So parents who can afford that are taking that up in droves because they're saying, we have the space, we can distance you. And there's a lot of questions in the community, and it's happening in districts around us. How is it I'm paying taxes for public schools, and yet if I could afford it, I'd be paying a lot to drop my kid off to have them walked through their virtual learning day, and then I can pick them up at the end of the day. And parents don't get that dichotomy. And to be honest, we don't really either, because in some cases there's retired or teachers who aren't working. So they're saying we have, you know, certificated teachers here to help you do your distance learning. And that's a real equity issue for me. You know, if you can't afford that and you have to work and you have a young kid who can't, you know, needs to be supervised, that's really important. So just to wrap it up, one thing that I was very insistent on as a board member is when we came back, rather than doing sort of a panicked, put together distance learning, is we need to have schedules. Because for me, that was a game changer for childcare. You know, you go into any kindergarten classroom, there will be a schedule. On Tuesdays, we go to the library. On, you know, Wednesdays, we do this. I don't want to tie teachers down, but if we have some kind of schedule, then a childcare, a babysitter, a grandma knows at 10:30 she does a reading group. You know, at 11 o'clock will be math. So for me, I needed, and fortunately our teachers were very accepting of that we had some kind of loose schedule and framework for them to work in so that childcare could at least have clarity on what the kids are supposed to be doing. But I do worry about this kind of pay for the helping with the virtual. And it's going like gangbusters, and it's happening all around. Also with the learning pods, the private learning pods in people's homes.
I will just jump in very quickly because I saw this morning in a local newspaper about free community services that are offering outdoor socially distanced help that are they're waitlisted to March and beyond because there's such few free resources. So just to add, because I just saw it 2 hours ago on that.
Yeah, I appreciate this question, and I think I have a couple different ways I can answer it. I mean, one is that I could point to things that we've done, such as, you know, opening or providing space in our public schools for traditional child care providers in our district who have done the after school and doing it on a limited basis for essential workers or people who really are in a hardship and need it. We've connected you know, our families with resources for childcare via sharing information. And we also partner with some people in the county who do social services type of work. So, you know, we've done what we can for the most part. But the other part of my answer is that we haven't mitigated the privilege that wealthy folks have who tend to be white, and how much easier they're going to have it with this kiddos not going back to school. I don't know that public schools can mitigate that. That is such a systemic, institutional, global issue. So we could do, you know, some things, but I also think about how did we end up with a situation where our public schools were so critical to all the functioning of our communities, that when we take away our public schools, the very fabric of our communities starts to unravel. Now, I think Charles could probably say the same thing with local government around, you know, some of the other services that city governments provide. But, you know, with schools, what we're really seeing is that can parents go to work or not, or caregivers, and are kids being fed or not? Are they having intervention in their mental health crises or not? Not to mention physical health. So yeah, great question. We've done a little bit, but there's no way to mitigate that kind of power system, short of a total dismantling of the way that our culture is designed.
Charles, anything to add on that question?
I mean, from a financial standpoint, it's sort of the same thing a lot of local governments heard during the Great Recession. What do you mean you can't do more with less? You know, that's the expectation of most citizens. And I'm not trying to be, you know, flippant here, but until services that people become used to decline or are taken away, there's no question about them. And then then you come up with a cost structure that allows you to provide those same level of services. You know, people are not thrilled because that usually means there's going to be a tax increase. And no one wants that. And plus, what elected board in their right mind is looking at a tax increase right now during the middle of the pandemic with, you know, skyrocketing unemployment levels and businesses having the challenges they have. So, yeah, no, to Chelsea's point, it's really hard to look at all these things, but it does show how critical the core functions of local governments and schools are to communities. And I think sometimes we obviously take those for granted. And we're having a lot of reckoning with those things on a socioeconomic level nationwide on a community basis. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how the next few months play out and how we continue to navigate this.
I just want to add one thing because it's dear to my heart, and I'm sure that Charles and Chelsea will agree. Apart from the socioeconomic equity, I worry about our special needs kids who get services that can really only be provided in schools. We're doing our best. We have special ed teachers and aides working, and there will be a few kids for whom, because special ed educators tell me all the time, sorry, that was redundant, special educators, that they're used to thinking out of the box. They're used to being creative, but you know, for every kid who will do well with some sort of online platform, there are some, you know, intense special needs that can't be met. And some of that can be answered with, you know, wealthy families who can supplement that, but not always. And those kids are on my mind a lot. So.
Often schools and local governments are the providers of sports, whether it's fields or gym space. And, you know, there's this movement, you know, let them play, where, you know, schools might be closed, but then you see, you know, parents advocating for those resources or those facilities to be open. Here in Oregon, a community close to where Chelsea lived, there was a baseball team that went to another state to play in a baseball tournament because it wasn't allowed in Oregon or in their county. And like 40 kids got COVID. I mean, it was just, you know, a horrible story. How are you seeing local governments and schools kind of balance that concept of sports, outdoor activities, and the use of your facilities when there is this like kind of organized movement to try to like make that happen, when you're also then saying, but our schools are also closed? Like, how are you balancing those kind of conflicting viewpoints?
With a little bit of blood, sweat, and tears is how we're balancing that one. It does require a partnership between ourselves and our city government. We do have some fences up around some schools that where the fencing was already existing, and other schools that are completely open. And we have some partnerships with our cities on whether or not we're calling in enforcement if policies are being broken around social distancing. It's a tough one. You know, I think the litigious nature of our society plays a very big role, because if the school owns some grounds, whether the school is open or not, if something happens on our grounds and there's some sort of outbreak, you know, is the school protected or not? And so I think that that's one of the things that's really driving the reticence to completely open fields. But it's spotty at best, you know, what's open and not open and why not.
Yeah, we're not open. We started at the beginning of the summer with, you know, non-contact sports, like, you know, could do conditioning. They couldn't even throw a ball. They couldn't go in the locker room. And we got calls from all kinds of people. Hey, there's kids on a field. That's all been shut down now. We do have this crazy situation where our fields and the city's fields are being used by groups from outside the area. So for instance, I have a friend who is on city council here, and she called me and said, there's like a softball game going on at Agora High School, and there's, you know, people with coolers and umbrellas. It's like a full on with refs. I drive over there. It's somebody from Ventura County, and they literally all jumped the fence and had a full on game. That's happening in some of the city parks. It's kind of crazy. It's like, you don't want to run people off for having a game, but we have these protocols and rules. So right now we're shut down for everything. How are you, Charles, handling like city owned facilities for this kind of thing, or county, or?
You know, I think there's a lot of caution, you know, back to the liability issue. Also just some of the community-wide public health standards that individual communities and regions have in place based on guidelines from the state. you know, to your point, Kirsten, about sports, obviously Virginia borders multiple states. And we have high schools in Kentucky and Tennessee, for example, that are doing varsity and JV sports, you know, in person on the fields. So you've got school systems that typically play those teams as part of their regular season, particularly in Tennessee and Kentucky. 5 miles away, they're playing a full-on season, and then the kids in our school systems are forced to postpone their system. So there's definitely a lot of hand-wringing, finger-pointing over, well, if they can do it 5 miles away, why can't we do it? And so I think that's a conversation that a lot of communities are having along all the border areas in particular, which is really challenging and doesn't make the decision making any easier.
Well, thanks everyone for your questions. I'm going to turn it back over to Pooja for some closing remarks. And then as a reminder, this has been recorded. It'll be live on the ELGL website later today. So from ELGL, thanks everyone for being here. And Pooja, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. So what you'll see in the chat right now are social media links for Davenport and ELGL. So if you had any questions that we were not able to get to, please send us a message on any of those platforms and follow us. Lastly, I will say the Davenport Institute does offer a virtual certificate program in engagement for local government leaders, and that link is being dropped into the chat as well. Applications are open for fall, so this is our shameless, not so shameless plug that if you're interested in conversations like these and you are in local government, we ask that you apply and join us virtually, of course. No taking over city fields for a certificate, I promise. And with that, I say thank you so much for being here.